The last presentation today would be done by Dr. Hugh Mc Dermott. Dr. Hugh Mc Dermott is a Member of Parliament of New South Wales in Australia. Before entering Parliament in 2015, he was an international lawyer and a university academic and human rights activist. Dr. Mc Dermott is well known to the Tamil community and a friend of the Tamils in New South Wales in Australia. He is well aware of the plight of Tamils based on the Human Rights Council's reports and the evidence that he has received. He regularly commemorates National Martyrs' Day, the Mullivaikal National Day of Mourning, and other Tamil Remembrance Days. He introduced the Tamil language to the national curriculum to the Australian school children in 2016. He is a sincere supporter of the values of justice and freedom to the Tamils in the island of Sri Lanka. He voices all forms of injustices, not only against the Tamils, but also any injustice committed against anyone who is disadvantaged or affected by the unjust methods of governments. அடுத்ததாக கலாநிதி ஹியூ மேக் டெர்மட் அவர்கள் உரையாற்றுவார்கள். இவர் ஆஸ்திரேலிய பாராளுமன்றத்திலே அங்கத்தவராக இருக்கின்றார். அத்தோடு பாராளுமன்றத்திற்கு வருவதற்கு முன்னதாக இவர் பல்கலைக்கழக பேராசிரியராகவும் அதேவேளையில் சர்வதேச நிறுவனங்களோடு மனித உரிமைக்காக குரல் கொடுக்கின்ற ஒருவராகவும் திகழ்ந்திருக்கின்றார். நியூ சவுத் வேல்ஸ் பகுதியிலே தமிழ் மக்களோடு நீண்ட காலமாக ஆழ்ந்த நீடித்த தொடர்பு கொண்ட இவர் தமிழ் மக்களுக்காகவும் உலகத்திலே அநீதி இழைக்கப்பட்ட எந்த சமூகத்துக்காகவும் குரல் கொடுக்கின்ற தன்மையோடு பாராளுமன்றத்திலே செயலாற்றி வருகின்றார். பல்கலைக்கழகத்திலே அத்தகைய செயல்பாட்டிலே அவர் ஈடுபட்டிருக்கின்றார். அண்மை காலத்தில் பாராளுமன்ற அங்கத்தவராக இருக்கும்போது 2016 ஆண்டிலே அவர் தமிழை ஒரு பாடமாக கற்பதற்கு தமிழ் பள்ளிக்கூடங்களிலே அதை ஈடுபடுத்துவதற்காக அல்லது கொண்டு வருவதற்காக முயற்சி செய்து அதில் வெற்றி கண்டிருக்கின்றார். நீதி, விடுதலை, சுதந்திரம் தமிழ் மக்களுக்கு கிடைக்க வேண்டும், இலங்கையிலே தமிழர்கள் சுதந்திரத்தோடு வாழ வேண்டும் என்ற அந்த கருத்திற்காக பல்வேறு மேடைகளிலே அவர் உரையாற்றியும் தமிழர்களுக்கு இந்த உரிமை மீள பெற்றுக் கொடுக்க வேண்டும் என்பதற்காக வாதாடியும் வருகின்றார். அவரை பேசுமாறு அன்போடு அழைக்கின்றோம். We now invite Dr. Hugh Mc Dermott to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you so much for inviting me today to address the conference on what is a day of remembrance of a terrible atrocity that was an ongoing atrocity that continued since independence and finally ended. Well, no, it hasn't ended. It continues today, but certainly perhaps the most heinous crime of the 21st century in 2009. I want to thank the TGTE for coordinating today and for inviting me. It's certainly heartening to see so many people throughout the world, not only in Australia, in New South Wales, but in the UK, in Canada, the US, India, and many other places who are on this conference or this Zoom call today to discuss this important issue. Thank you for that introduction. That was very flattering and I appreciate it. I, as a Member of Parliament in New South Wales, am privileged to represent the largest Tamil population in the country. I am very, very privileged that my friends and neighbours are Tamil. But more than that, for some reason, my very multicultural electorate bears witness to some of the worst atrocities of this and last century. In my electorate, in the electorate of Prospect, we have a large Tamil population, those subjected to the horrors of the Sri Lankan government post-independence and during the Civil War, and even today. But also I have the largest Assyrian and Armenian populations from northern Iraq and parts of the Middle East, who also had genocide committed against them at the hands of the Ottoman Empire and the Turks, and most recently by ISIS. In fact, 7,000 refugees have come into this electorate from northern Iraq, being subjected to the fundamentalism of ISIS in the last few years, and have fled here to Australia and into the electorate of Prospect. I also have a large South Sudanese population who were also subjected to genocide at the hand of the Sudanese and others. I also have a mosque, and it's a Bosnian mosque from Central Europe, also victims of genocide. So, for whatever reason, I have had the privilege to represent not only the Tamil community and attempt to voice what has happened since independence to the Tamil people, but also those communities. They all have had genocide committed against them, and there has been international recognition to varying degrees of all those genocides. Now, I very much believe it is time that we continue on as members of Parliament, but also as members of communities throughout the world, to make sure that not only is the Tamil genocide recognised, but also that there is an education program and that people understand truly what happened. So thank you. I don't want to repeat everything which others have said, so I'm going to try over the next 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, to try and get a bit more detail and then talk about what the definitions of genocide really are, because the term genocide is thrown around by many different groups. But there has to be a definition which is obviously is there, but in academic circles as well as by the United Nations. And we must then look at what has happened to the Tamils, whether it fits that criteria. And I have no doubt it does. Now, our actions, and what you would have all known, you've seen attacks against me by this current government in Sri Lanka, will continue on. And I believe as we push towards genocide recognition throughout the world, it will just increase. We have a Sri Lankan government which is full of criminals. I have said that openly, and I will say it in Parliament, and I will say it in the media. The Rajapaksa regime, as it stands today, is determined to obliterate the knowledge of what happened during the genocide, as are the Turkish government of what happened against the Armenians and the Assyrians and the Greeks, as is the Sudanese against the South Sudanese and others. We must not let that happen. So, as I mentioned before, this genocide began at least, but certainly in a formal sense, after Sri Lankan independence, after the removal of the British. The whole determination of the newly established Sri Lankan government post-independence was to alienate the Tamil population, both physically, politically, and economically. The most telling way of that happening, of seeing that happening, was in the form of legislation. Now, speakers already today have touched on that, have touched on a number of pieces of legislation, the standardisation, for example, but there is more. If you look at the legislation that's happened and been put through, but from 1948 to 1983, we see the systematic structure being built to discriminate against Tamils, as well as others, against Catholics, as in Muslims, against anybody else who didn't fit in to the Sinhalese regime. And we see a similar thing that happened to other populations, as we see in Burma at the moment, with their equivalent there. So let's look at this. Across the 6 decades, we saw, firstly, the Citizenship Act in 1948. The bill that discriminated against Indian Tamils by denying them citizenship, hence preventing them from voting. This was the first step, removing the rights of a voice in the parliament, removing a right to vote, At the time, in 1948, when this legislation came through, the Tamils made up 11.7% of the population. Today, in 2020, it's around 4%. The Act specifically said that anyone wishing to obtain citizenship had to prove that they were at least third-generation immigrants, which was an impossible task for the majority of Tamils and others. To have such documentation was next to impossible. So, what this then did, less than 5,000 or around 5,000 Tamils qualified for citizenship, while over 700,000 did not. Many were deported. People who had lived their lives and generations in Sri Lanka were forced out of the country. The Sudanese government then went on to the Sinhala Only Act of 1956. Of course, as many of you know, over 30% of the government positions at the time of independence was held by Tamils. They had all kinds of government jobs, both senior to quite junior, clerical, railways, postal, customs service, and 40% of other labour forces within the public sector. They were all then discriminated against in a concerted campaign to remove them from government service. It was a serious advantage that prevented them from attaining high positions in politics or any federal service. And many were forced to resign from their positions due to illiteracy in the Sinhala language. It was a way of suppressing people by use of their culture and of their language. And as you may know, and as you probably do, one of the ways of suppressing a people that has happened many, many times over many centuries is to take away their language. We've seen it time and again. We saw it recently in the Middle East with ISIS, for example, where people who were in a Syrian background weren't allowed to speak anything but Arabic. A number of regimes in other parts of the Middle East did the same thing. My family background is Irish. My family came to this country, to Australia, fleeing the pogroms that were against Catholics in the north of Ireland. Part of the British times in the 1800s and before was to suppress the Irish language until it was almost lost. The Sudanese did a similar thing, attempting to do that with the Tamil language. And that is one of the reasons why I'm such a supporter of the Tamil language here in Australia, but also throughout the world, because we need to make sure the language continues, because it is a key part of the culture of the Tamil people, going back thousands of years. Now, obviously, in that time, when the Sinhala Only Act in 1956 came in, there were peaceful demonstrations. As you can imagine, the government of the time suppressed them with any Tamil pogroms in 1956 and 1958 in retaliation. Houses were burnt, businesses were destroyed, people lost their lives. Then there was the standardisation policy of 1971, which the previous speaker, Professor, has touched on, restricting Tamil students from post-secondary education and institution, suppressing a people by not letting them go into the professions, not giving them opportunities to raise themselves out of poverty, not giving themselves opportunities of having a future. They had to know their place. That is what the government was telling the Tamil population. They weren't allowed education. Simple as that. So from 1971 to 1977, the policy ensured that the numbers of students qualifying for university entrance from each language was proportionate to the number of students who sat the university entrance examinations in that language, meaning that Tamil-speaking students had to score much higher in their results than other Sudanese-speaking students to gain admission to university. It was a very subtle way of just removing smart young Tamils from the education system. Sri Lankan Tamils made up to 70% of university students in the country prior to this. Some of 35 to 45% of these students were in medical schools. Significant numbers. the intellectual cream of that country. But because they were Tamil, they were removed from that. And once again, we've seen that in other countries. I mentioned the Syrians and Armenians before. Same thing happened to them in Iraq. Same thing over a number of decades. So in 1969, in the northern provinces of Sri Lanka, which is 94% Tamil at the time, it makes up 7% of the general population. They took up some 27.5% of the entrance of science-based courses. They too were excluded. And it was reduced from 27.5% to 7%. This also happened in the western parts, in Colombo, and that reduced from 26% to down to 26% from 69%. So quite significant. So the structures were well there, truly there in the legal framework. And there was myriad of other pieces of legislation. I only touch on the largest ones, and regulations and actions that were put in place at a local and federal level to discriminate against the Tamil population. This structural genocide, this structural framework for destroying Tamil culture, Tamil education systems, and their future. This was now forcing people to leave the country. This was forcing people more and more into poverty as the decades progressed. And of course, the militarization of the North continued and built prior to the beginning of the Civil War. State-sponsored destruction of Tamil sites through planning laws, through actions of the police and the military, and of course of those who were in league with the government from private industry. They continued to go through, and when the pogroms started, which were orchestrated, which were controlled by the government and sponsored by the government, the destruction of the Jaffna Library, which we mentioned earlier today, and other cultural institutions, as well as homes, as well as businesses, and the seizure of land continued and continues on to this day. And the army and the police and other bodies have all helped orchestrate and structure this and protect it. Now, back in Black July in 1983, the orchestrated pogroms against the Tamil population are well known. We've talked about it today. We honour it to those people who lost their lives today. And even though that seemed like the height of the worst that could happen to the Tamil people, it wasn't. The decades that then followed the Civil War, and finally, the Tamil population had been pushed to such an extent that they stood up against this repression, finally had its worst outcome in 2009. And that leads us to now to what the world saw on those days in 2009. Certainly the world population, the world international institutions knew about the Civil War. We read about it all the time, no matter what our backgrounds were, no matter where we lived, we read about the ongoing problems in the Civil War, the deaths, the bombings. But it was in 2009 which the world was really, I think, shocked by what happened. And of course, the Sri Lankan government and the military tried everything it could to suppress the facts and suppress what happened, and continues to do that today. So now we go to the question of what can then be done. Where do we go from here? It has been over a decade since the massacres in 2009. And it has been decades since the first initial pogroms that we recognise and acknowledge today that led to Black July. We've had resolutions before the UN that the Sri Lankan government has paid lip service to, that they would set up investigations, that they would look into crimes that had happened on all sides. Of course, nothing has happened. And the Rajapaksa regime has a vested interest of not letting the United Nations or any other body really investigate what happened. They know their hands are dripping in blood. They know they were involved. This wasn't just a fight of a civil war. This was genocide. So let's just look at a definition of genocide. Now, if we just use the United Nations definition, I'm going to do this because you will know that as I read these words, you will know of examples, you will know of stories you've read and the facts and the documentation and the evidence. So in 1946, prior to independence, the United Nations recognized for its General Assembly the crime of genocide and codified it in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Obviously, this was in reaction to the Holocaust throughout Europe. And there was determination by the United Nations at the time, the winning powers, the allies, that this could not happen again. The tens of millions of people who had died at the hands of the Nazis and other regimes had to be recognized and had to be stopped for in the future. Sadly, that didn't happen, as we've seen. So this definition has been further clarified by the International Court of Justice, which has repeatedly stated that the Convention embodies principles that are part of a general customary international law. Now, I raise that because this means that whether or not a state has ratified the Genocide Convention, they are all bound as a matter of law by the principle that genocide is a crime prohibited under international law. So no one is exempt, no country, none, certainly not Sri Lanka. So Article 2 of the Genocide Convention defines the crime. So let me go through what it is. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. As such, firstly, killing members of the group. Secondly, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Imposing measures intended to prevent bursts within the group. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So those 5 points, no doubt you will have examples for each one. I certainly do. I can go and sit with my Tamil community here in Sydney and talk at functions, at lunch, at breakfast with them, and we will find evidence amongst those groups every single time of such things. Now, this popular understanding of what constitutes genocide tends also to be broader. So we've had the UN Convention, but the context of the norm under international law is broader. And there has to be 2 elements to make it broader for a crime of genocide. A mental element, that is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. We've seen that from the Sri Lankan government. A physical element, which includes the following 5 acts: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures to prevent births in the group, and forcibly transferring children. We've seen all those things over the decades, and we even see many of them today in Sri Lanka. So there is no question in my mind that the case for genocide can be made. None at all. So if that is the case, if I can sit here and say this, and no doubt other jurists, lawyers and academics can also do it, why haven't we done it enough? Why isn't it before these national criminal courts? Well, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. And we saw that with the banning of the Tamil Tigers and others. You had very large groups, very influential groups in the UN and other places who were determined to suppress the truth. So that will continue. Whether it be India, China, because don't forget China now is a vested interest in Sri Lanka with their investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, the Sri Lankan government, of course, and others. In Australia, we see a national government who has no doubt done many deals with the Sri Lankan government to stop refugee boats coming to this country. It was a key part of their policies against the Tamil population trying to gain entry and fleeing the war and the post-war times, civil war times. So there are many interested players who have vested interests to make sure that Tamil genocide is not recognised. And this isn't the first fight like this that has happened. A similar fight is happening at the moment between the Armenian and Syrian Greek populations who had genocide committed against them and the Turkish administration in this present day. So what do we do? What can be done to recognise genocide? Now, firstly, as I mentioned already, we really need to document the evidence, matching the criteria of genocide as I've talked about. I know a lot of people have done this. I know that has been pulled together, and it has to continue because we need to have all of those testimony. We need to have the evidence and build it. We've got that to a point, but it needs to continue. A key part of that, once it is built and as it's built, is to educate members of parliament, in my opinion. Not only in my country, but every country. We've seen in Ontario that they've pushed to have a bill to recognise Tamil Genocide and Education Week. And that's really, really wonderful. That led the world. But let's be very straight with this. It hasn't passed into law yet. It's still a bill. It is still being reviewed by their parliament. So we must continue to push to make sure it is. But every Tamil population in the world, every community must approach their MPs and educate them. I think that is important. People like myself, before I was elected to Parliament, I'd seen the press releases, I'd seen the media, but knew very little about what had happened in any detail. It wasn't until I was invited in 2015, I think it was, to come to a commemoration service for the Tamil population for May 18. And I came to this, I was the only non-Tamil there. And I walked in and there were 300 families who were there, who had all had people killed in the last days of the Civil War. The stories they told me broke me down. And I've never been the same since. That was a key part for me to start to understand what had happened and learn about the genocide. That is what the Tamil populations throughout the world, the communities, need to do with their MPs. They need to educate them. And I say this because they are leaders in their communities, but also they're a voice in their national and state parliaments. And that's the next step. As part of a strategy to get genocide recognised throughout the world, I firmly believe that we need to educate our MPs so they will have their parliaments formally recognise the Tamil genocide. Now, I don't mean just making a speech. None of MPs do that. We need formal recognition of the genocide by individual parliaments. In the Armenian community, they have been doing exactly that. They have been going to parliaments throughout the world and convincing their MPs to put bipartisan motions up to recognise the Armenian, Assyrian, Greek genocide. And that has been happening. It happened here in New South Wales. We were one of the first to do it back in the 90s. but it has been an ongoing struggle for them for decades. Now, the Armenian, Assyrian, Greek genocide happened in 1915. That's how long they have been fighting this fight for recognition. We are in the early stages, but I do believe that we need to start to do that. The more countries, the more federal and state parliaments that recognise that there was a genocide, the better. And that builds more and more structures and more pressure on the world community to make sure that the Sri Lankan perpetrators are brought to justice. The next thing I think we need to do is recognise that the UN resolutions that have been put forward and agreed to through lip service by the Sri Lankan government will never ever be implemented. The Sri Lankan government, especially in this present form, but throughout the civil war and before, has a vested interest to make sure that the Tamil population is not recognised as having genocide committed against it. So the resolutions are important, but like, as you know, there has been a number of referrals and go on, and they haven't, deferrals rather, and they haven't actually been implemented. I don't believe they ever will. So that means we must put pressure on the UN bodies and the United Nations through its members to refer the Sri Lankan government to the International Criminal Court. It needs to happen. All we are doing now is seeing a delay of that process. The sooner there is a referral to the International Criminal Courts so they can investigate crimes against humanity and the war crimes committed by the Sri Lankan government and their military, the better. That has to happen. Once that does happen, I do believe that there is the evidence there for convictions. And that's where we have to go in the future. So from my point of view, and what I've just discussed, it lays out a plan on how and where we should be going for genocide recognition. Now, I'm quite happy to be discussed with you about this, quite happy to be given better ideas, but that's what I think should happen. And certainly that is the process which I'm going to start. We have been doing here in New South Wales in Australia, and I want to certainly to work with the world community to do this. So thank you for today. Thank you for letting me have my piece. And let me make it very clear. No matter what the Sri Lankan government does attacking me, no matter what they say, no matter how many ambassadors or others continue to lobby me to withdraw my comments, that will not happen. And I believe that any MP who is aware and is of the evidence and does not step up and is not prepared to stand up against the Sri Lankan government is a coward and is not fulfilling their job as a leader. And that is why the Tamil population, the Tamil communities throughout the world need to go and see their MPs and make sure they do. Because the Sri Lankan government will not stop. They will do whatever they can to stop the Tamil genocide being recognised and for them being prosecuted and brought to account. There must be justice. And together we will achieve that justice. It won't be an easy road and it won't be a quick road, but we can do it and we will. So thank you. Vadakam, Nidri, thank you so much for today. And I look forward to continue to work with you until we get justice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hugh Mc Dermott, for this very courageous and insightful presentation. You have outlined to us from 1948 up to now as to how the government of Sri Lanka has been engaged in a form of structural genocide, and you painted all the many phases of that genocide, beginning from the curtailment of the possibilities for education, the potentials for employment, beginning already with the disenfranchisement of the Indian Tamil population, whom we like to refer as the hill country Tamil population. There were no more Indian Tamils because they were brought in there by early part of the 18th century, and they were still called Indian Tamils in the sense they were de-citizenized in order to be repatriated after 150 years of working there and contributing to the country, which no country in the world will ever do today. With 5 years of stay in Canada, one can become a citizen in Canada, and so is many other countries where Sinhalese themselves have been citizens, and denying citizenship to more than 500,000 people, Tamils, by Parliamentary Act in 1948 was one of the most discriminatory things that they ever did. But that discrimination continued right up to 2009, as we have so clearly and neatly identified. And in the context of the definition of genocide as placed by United Nations, you outlined to us also how the Tamil situation fits in, as much as also the other countries like Syria, the situation of the Kurds, and many others with whom you have been also working, and whose countries are whose citizens are living in your constituency. You also gave us insights as to how we should work on it. First of all, the importance of documenting the evidence, and secondly, to educate parliamentarians, MPs, and thirdly, to push for the recognition of Tamil genocide at the level of the world in different countries, and then to continue to hold the government of Sri Lanka accountable through our efforts and effective action with the support of the United Nations, and to have the accountability charged at the criminal courts at the international level. And the government of Sri Lanka certainly knows about it and tries all means to escape it, as we have stated. And it's our duty, those of us who are living, to speak for the dead. And I think this is a very good instruction that you have given us, advice and insight, and we should continue to work on it from today, and we hope we will join hands in doing it.